I am super excited today to have with me a couple of my regular partners in crime, it seems, for these types of conversations. Celia Merzbacher, Deputy Director of the QED-C, that's the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, and John Wise, consultant with the Pistoia Alliance. Uh, you know, it's good to see you both here. It's good to have you both together again. It feels like we're now in sort of a regular basis. We might as well just get this scheduled every 3 months or every 2 months, I think, to get together and give an update as well about our collaborative engagement. And so why don't we start off, Celia, if you want to go ahead, just tell us what's been happening recently with the QED-C in relation especially to quantum expansion in the pharma space.
Thanks, Brian. And it's great to be here with you again. I am with the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, as Brian mentioned, which is a US-led initiative. It's really industry-driven to enable and grow the quantum industry. And while it's got very broad interests, there's a particular interest in advancing quantum computing for practical use, and the pharmaceutical sector is one of the areas where we see real ability to be disruptive and impactful, and that led to working together with Pistoia and QPharm. We're looking forward to extending that collaboration and to sharing with you some of what we're planning for the next year or so. So thank you.
That's great. And then John, why don't you take a couple of minutes, tell us about the Pistoia Alliance and tell us about some of the things you guys have been working on recently.
Brian, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here once more with you and Celia. Yes, well, the Pistoia Alliance is it is, if you will, the eponymous Pistoia Alliance, because it was conceived in Pistoia in Tuscany in 2007, and it became incorporated in 2008 and has been carrying on its mission to lower barriers to pre-competitive collaboration in life science R&D ever since. We have a multiplicity of projects, activities, communities of interest, workshops, publications, all that kind of work. And what we've been doing since we last met, Brian and Celia, is to have the annual conference, which of course had to be a virtual annual conference, but we had over 1,500 registrants, and we had some great speakers. Andy Plump from Takeda, their president of R&D, and Takeda, you will know very well, is a strong player in QPharm, our friend Emir Roach. And we had Jay Bradner from the head of Novartis Institute for Biomedical Research was talking too. So we had this sort of week-long conference. One of the tracks, which I think we might like to exploit in future conferences, was entitled In Silico Drug Discovery and Development. I think some of the work in quantum computing could easily be put into that space going forward. Anyhow, that's what I've been up to in the last few years.
Excellent. And you know, I had the opportunity to participate in listening to some of the presentations. You know, our own chief scientific officer and head of R&D, Tom Hudson, participated in one of those panels. And, you know, he's been the driver of a real sea change around this idea of convergence within AbbVie. And I think it's one of the interesting things when we think about this concept of convergence, and quantum computing itself is exactly that, right? It's bringing together physicists and theoretical physicists and quantum physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists and chemists. And I think that specifically, when we think about QPharm and what QPharm has been doing recently, has been a real great opportunity. We talk about folks like Philip Harbach at Merck Group and what they've been doing around their community of interest related to quantum computing that they've built, which has people from all over the Merck Group, not just in the pharma space, even some of their materials folks. And then we look at what the hackathon that QPharm is currently looking at facilitating and working on, and all of the feedback that we've had from across the different pharma members has been, here are the various different use cases that are interesting to me, whether they're drug discovery or supply chain optimization and supply chain risk assessment. Whether, we've seen some really eccentric and really great ideas come through as part of our own internal work of trying to figure out how do we drive this hackathon concept forward within QPharm. But I think it leads us to sort of the crux of the discussion here for us is how do we drive quantum computing in the pharma space forward with use case selection? How do we find this right use case selection? And I think that when we think about the end goal of use case selection, there's a sort of a question of why. Why do we need to pick a use case or a set of use cases to target on? Celia, can you kind of talk to us a little bit about how important that is for the QED-C participants in terms of how they choose to direct their work and efforts?
Sure. It's really essential, or in any case, critical to accelerating progress, to have that pull of the end customer understood so that the earlier stage development can be organized and directed in such a way to, as efficiently as possible, achieve certain capabilities and goals. So it's much more desirable for these folks who are developing the systems, developing the software, building the whole stack, to be doing that towards some kind of a target. And so this conversation that we're establishing and carrying forward is going to be essential to creating demand and markets for quantum computing, and then benefits that are going to ultimately reach society and customers.
Yeah, and I think that leads us exactly to the conversation that we wanted to talk about today, as we had talked in advance of this, about the idea of a bit of a roadmap, if you will, for quantum computing and the pharma industry, and how we see the three of our organizations together helping lay out that roadmap to bring the pharma folks in line with the technology, to bring the technology folks in line with the pharma needs, and together stay into alignment. And Celia, you talked when we were thinking about this panel in advance about the semiconductor industry and about how the semiconductor industry created a roadmap, if you will, that became a real foundation for a lot of companies to apply for grants and to bring forward their technology focus along there. And I think that that's a great parallel to what we can do here in this space. So, John, I think the first step that we had talked about in this idea of building this roadmap was getting more education, having these webinars or these tutorial kind of sessions to bring together the pharma folks and the technology folks. Do you think I think we all agree that there needs to be a way to drive that. Is that something we think Pistoia is then the right place for us to create that momentum with these tutorials and webinars to bring the folks together?
Well, Brian, absolutely. I think so. If I could just sort of take a moment to reinforce something Celia said there about having a use case, having a target that people can focus on. And I think that it was one of the takeaways from the webinar that we collectively organized, QED-C, QPharm, and the Pistoia Alliance, back in the summer. And we polled the audience. I don't know how many people were there, say about 200 on this webinar. And one of the questions we asked was, what is holding you back in the exploitation of quantum computing? Most people, not all, but most people said the lack of some clear use cases that articulate the value of quantum computing, and we can then use those use cases in conversation with our peers and our masters to raise funds for more work to be done. So I think this use case is important, and clearly use case selection is extremely important. A couple of ideas spring to mind. One is that we could have a conversation with some of the key protagonists of quantum computing in the pharmaceutical industries and subject matter experts. You mentioned Philip from Merck Group, Ross Walker from GSK, our friend Emir Roach from Takeda, you yourself, Brian, in the vanguard of all this. And we could select a use case and then do something with it. That would not be a complete waste of time at all. Or perhaps it's or we could run a kind of webinar program, educational program, where we got some life science experts who need quantum computing, aligned with some quantum computing experts who knew about the challenges in life science, and have some, if you like, tutorial sessions explaining what the scientific problem is and the technologists explaining how their approach to technology can transform that problem. What cannot easily be done with high performance computing in the current domain might easily be done in quantum computing in a future domain. And then having a series of those, and then perhaps having the audience to vote on which of those use cases they find most appealing, most tractable, something that they could take back into their organizations and work with. Or perhaps, there are other ideas too. I'm sure Celia's got some ideas about how we might find the right use case and stimulate support for the engineering of that use case.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to sort of the proposition that we, the three of us, and this panel, and representing our organizations a little bit, are kind of put to the audience here, that the path forward, we think, can be driven by the three of our organizations through a bit of a roadmap that is defined by us doing some of this education, this collaborative sharing of the minds. Follow that with a little bit of a competition, even though it's in this pre-competitive space, to really bubble up using community interest and community feedback, voting, some mechanism like that to bubble up. Here are the top use cases. And I think one of the interesting questions, and Celia, I'm going to come to you to talk a little bit about this, is what do you do with it once you have those use cases? Once we've got this clear sort of prioritization, what's the next step? And so Celia, something that we had talked about before was the QUEST program that QED-C is working towards. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about QUEST and how that would affect that sort of next step once these use cases are identified?
Sure. And I'd like to actually just take a first step and put out some sort of ideas with regard to the use case targeting, because a year ago at Q2B, we had a gathering where we talked a lot about use cases, and we have some lists. I think we're not the only one that has such lists. So how do we go from these collections of use cases to identifying the ones that might be first on the list to address? QED-C is actually developing a tool now to try to prioritize research needs and technology development when there's a fog or a sea of opportunity. And we're doing it initially in the area of laser technologies, but if that project goes well, we would have a tool that might be useful in this space as well for collecting a lot of factors, getting expert input, and then by using various sort of weights, coming up with a prioritization that's based on some data and some evidence and the readiness of technology and so on, risks and markets and so on. So once we have that challenge, then we have a number of ways forward for actually tackling them. And one of those is a proposal that's been put forward and has actually been introduced as a piece of legislation in the US Congress for funds to be made available to support use of quantum computing resources with government funds. So proposals would be made to access these funds and use them to run problems on quantum computers that are available now. Those proposals would presumably be strengthened by being able to point to the work of this collaboration to identify the real opportunities and needs. So that sort of roadmap can have a lot of value and impact very broadly in the research world by sort of underpinning and supporting various good ideas that are going to come from everywhere to tackle the challenges that we identify. So the education, the target identification, the roadmap, and then getting all hands on deck to help tackle that problem and make some real progress.
And I think that that shows that there is this great opportunity for these competitive alliances like ours in the Q-Pharm space, and like the partnerships with QED-C and Pistoia together, to be able to provide some clarity and to provide a little bit of legitimacy and it's not even legitimacy, really. It's that extra endorsement, if you will, that research is supported by need or by solid cases, these use cases, where it will be valuable, as opposed to something that is, maybe not going to be as valuable down the road. And in the early stages of this type of research, being able to demonstrate that value is really important. So I think that the idea that we're talking about here is that we're going to start with creating these educational and these engagement opportunities to bring together the pharma people and the tech people in the quantum space and start sharing the problems and the capabilities across there. And we want to funnel that maybe through this framework, Celia, like that QED-C is talking about, to validate and help prioritize use cases in the space. And then lastly, anybody applying for grant funding, whether it's through the eventual Quest program, if it's approved through the legislative process, or other grant approaches, or even just independent commercial entities seeking VC funding or seeking investor funding, to be able to say with commitment and with conviction, what we're doing is valuable because all three of these groups are telling us that it's valuable. They're providing commitment to these use cases. I think is going to be a super valuable piece of tooling for everybody as we investigate this space. And it may even have the potential to say, listen, if me at a pharma company can see that the whole industry is committed to exploring the value here, maybe my stakeholders should be willing to invest in that type of exploratory research on our own as well, independent or through vehicles like the Pistoia types of collaborations and things like that. So hopefully, I think this roadmap that we're setting up of tutorial and education, competitive prioritization and evaluation of use cases, and committed support, obviously not funded support, but committed support of our three organizations towards those use cases as prioritized in there, should hopefully provide a lot of clarity to people moving forward.
And I would add, the community that will be built in the process will create alliances where the teams will naturally form and ideas will emerge. So it's going to be a hotbed of, I think, innovation and bringing together the communities to make progress.
Absolutely. Yes, John, you were going to say something?
Yes, sorry, a small point. I think probably you have made it, but I just wanted to amplify. I guess in a way I could say I'm not so concerned about the big farmers because they know how to look after themselves to a greater or lesser extent. And also the grant-giving organizations, have got their own splendid bureaucracy which will allow them to make the right decision at the right time. I was thinking of the small startup company. I think quantum computing is rich in small startup companies. And there is a challenge. The challenge is not their understanding of quantum computing, quantum technology, quantum programming. That they are excellent at. I think their challenge would be to get a feel for the marketplace. In this case, it's the life science marketplace we're talking about. And so the opportunity of being part of this collaboration we have with QED-C, Q-Pharm, and the Pistoia Alliance allows them to get that holistic view, if you will, of the areas in life science R&D which are amenable to quantum computing-based technology solutions. So I think for those small companies, this is particularly important.
I absolutely agree. And so on that note, I want to thank you, Celia, and thank you, John, as always, for joining me and joining in this discussion together. I think folks who are watching, if you have feedback about this idea that we're throwing out there, about this process, by all means, please reach out to us. Please share with us your thoughts and your opinions on this, as we're all just trying to look forward and push pushed forward together the ability to, provide patient impact in as many possible ways as we can. Quantum computing, just one avenue for it. Thank you all for joining us. Take care, be safe, and be well.